This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop game day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
Deep in the ocean, an orca pod is on the hunt. But these aren't your average orcas. These guys are organized.
Marketing team, did you get those social media posts scheduled for the SEAL migration?
Aye, Captain. We even have an automated notification for all pod managers when they go live.
They use Monday.com to keep their teamwork sharp, their communication clear, and their goals in sight. Monday.com. For whatever you run, even orcas. Go to Monday.com to dive deeper.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give
it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Alistair Owen, a fantastic writer whose first book was a series of conversations with the legendary filmmaker Bruce Robinson, filmmaker director of course of Jennifer 8 and probably most famously How to Get Ahead in Advertising. I'm kidding, Withnail and I. Of course I was talking about Withnail and I. He's also written books about screenwriting, and he's also written a interview book with Christopher Hampton, and we cover all of it. If you enjoy the episode, please remember to like, subscribe, leave a review if you wish. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation. I'm a little bit nervous about interviewing you because obviously you are the king of the Q&A.
Well, that's fine because actually I'm very rarely interviewed. I was rather touched that one of my interviewees for my most recent book, The Art of Screen Adaptation, Olivia Hetry, the screenwriter of Andrea Arnold's Wuthering Heights, and Girl with a Pearl Earring, suggested interviewing me for the Writers Guild for a Zoom event. This was during lockdown, because she used to be president of the Writers Guild, and I was rather touched by that, and I did enjoy it. Although I'm so used to asking questions that it actually became more of a kind of two-way Q&A, really. But I've done, I did a few podcasts to help publicize the book, and it's rather nice to have the tables turn occasionally, although it does make me realize how eloquent some of my interviewees are.
Yeah, when people speak in paragraphs, it makes me just feel how tongue-tied I often get, and especially editing these podcasts, I get to hear my stupidity repeated and try desperately to edit bits out where I'm going for about half an hour, but
well, that's the joy of the interviewer's art, whether or not it's a podcast or a Q&A. I can make myself look incredibly smart on the page. I can rewrite my questions completely, and usually do, to be honest. because the answer is normally illuminated, whatever it was I was actually trying to ask. And I realize I need to articulate that in a rather clearer way for the reader.
You just write your questions as basically a form of paraphrase of their answer and then put right ? At the end.
No, I think that really would be cheating. The interview, the Q&A process is fascinating, and the editing process, although it's very involved, can also be fascinating. I kind of don't like to pull the curtain back too much, because, put it this way, I was always amused by one review of Smoking in Bed, the Bruce Robinson book, where it said Bruce Robinson's off-the-cuff comments reading like polished prose or something, and I thought, yes, there's a reason for that. Although, I mean, he is a unique interviewee. I've only ever interviewed one other person who comes out with such unique phrases, has such a unique way of talking, and that's the screenwriter Sarah Phelps, who again I interviewed for The Art of Screen Adaptation, who's did the Ray Winstone Great Expectations and most of the more recent Agatha Christie's on the BBC. She is a force of nature, Sarah. She's absolutely brilliant, and I was so thrilled. I think I decided to order the book alphabetically just so that I could put her last, so that I could end with her swearing, because it sent the book off on just the right note, I felt.
But that's what I enjoyed about reading both the Art of Screen Adaptation and the Screenwriters book. Excuse me, was the fact that the personalities come out so well. You know, it's kind of unsurprising, I guess, because writers, you know, are using language all the time. So it'd be a little bit disappointing if their own language wasn't up to snuff.
Oh, absolutely. I've enjoyed doing these books enormously. They don't pay very well. They're a bit niche in terms of sales, although Smoking in Bed actually did, for this kind of book, take off quite well and has been read. I think it's one of those Samizdat style things where people pass it around. For every one person that's bought it, it has to have been read by 2 or 3. Just statistically, I've come across more people in my life who've read it when I say, you know, what I've done. I read that book. That's a great book, than can possibly have bought it based on the sales numbers. But no, and it's partly because they're all such interesting and different personalities. And people even now still don't talk to screenwriters that often, not as often as they talk to actors or directors. And so you generally have access to almost anyone you want, actually. I mean, I've had a few turn downs, kind of unsurprising turn downs. I tried to get Tom Stoppard 2 anthologies in a row and failed both times, but that's no particular surprise. But on the whole, anyone I want to interview is happy to be interviewed, and they're all so different. But as you say, that's as it should be. The writer's voice is one of the key things about, you know, why screenwriters end up becoming successful as writers. Is what agents look for, is what producers look for, is that unique voice. Whether or not they're then allowed to exercise that voice in their screenwriting career is a separate question, and one which Bruce's career rather interestingly sheds light on, I think.
You say it's quite kind of niche, and I mean, as the host of a podcast on writers on film, I feel your pain. But how did you get here? What's your you yourself are a screenwriter, right?
Yes, I am. I had to take the step and actually call myself that for the purposes of my website, which I created partly to publicize The Art of Screen Adaptation, partly to publicize a novel, my first novel, a short novel that I put on Kindle at the same time. I've always been a bit hesitant about calling myself a screenwriter because I've not actually been produced, but I am agented. I have had stuff out in the industry. I did do one commissioned project, which was an interesting learning curve, although ultimately not very successful. And I'm still pursuing it. I just finished writing a pilot, of 1 hour pilot for a TV drama series. I write with a friend of mine from university. We storyline stuff together, and we've got a couple of things, 2 or 3 things lined up that we want to do. So I'm sort of still pursuing that alongside the books. And actually, I find that interviewing writers, and I know I'm not the only writer that feels this way. Interviewing writers or talking to writers, reading writers talking about their craft, I find extremely useful for my own craft. You know, you never stop learning, I think, if you're any good. And you can always learn something new from other, even if it's just you find that 2 or 3 writers, as I did when I did screen adaptation, you find that 2 or 3 or 4 or more of the 12 interviewees do exactly what you do. That's heartening. Oh, good. Well, if they're doing it and they're all multiply produced, then I must be, kind of on the right track. Or they'll say something you hadn't thought of. The differences between the interviews in that book were as interesting as the similarities. Voiceover, particularly, some people were vehemently opposed to it, and others were big fans of it. Now, I happen to be a big fan of it if used right. Sorry, that was a tangent off your question. The screenwriting was my first sort of, well, originally I wanted to be a film director, but then I directed a few plays at university, and I swiftly realized I wasn't actually that great at working with actors. So I thought, well, that's probably not going to work, although that hasn't stopped plenty of film directors through history. Then I switched to screenwriting. I was already starting to think about writing in my late teens. I started writing a spec adaptation of a young adult novel I was particularly interested in at the time, and then I did another spec adaptation of a war novel, and I sort of taught myself to write through these adaptations. I was a huge film buff in my teens. I still remember whole sections of Halliwell's Film Guide. I was rather amused to read Jonathan Coe's last novel, Mr. Wilder and Me, because the female heroine of that also is a fan of Halliwell's Film Guide and has the ability to, name cinematographers and so forth of movies she's never seen. I can still do that. It's good for film quizzes. And I think partly because of that, I thought at one point I might, the first inkling I ever had that I might want to write a book about film, I think, was I had the crazy notion of doing a biographical dictionary of British screenwriters. Can you imagine? I mean, that would be a lifetime project. But I wrote a couple of entries, sort of mini essays on a couple of directors who I was interested in at the time. And one of them was Bruce Robinson. Obviously, I'd seen Widnall. A friend of mine had that and lent that to me on video many times. This was back in the heyday of video rentals. And there was a bit of a hole in the corner outfit in a town near where my folks lived. And I'd often go down there with my dad once or twice a week. And I think I might have seen this reviewed in Empire, was Bruce Robinson's third film, his Hollywood thriller Jennifer 8, with Andy Garcia, Uma Thurman, and John Malkovich. And it bypassed the cinemas completely in the UK, went straight to video. I mean, in these days, straight to video isn't even a thing. You really don't know so much anymore what is a cinema release and what isn't. It's present and available either on a screen or via streaming or whatever. But there was something interesting to me about the fact that the guy that did Widnall, which, was already a cult thing by that time, 92, had made a Hollywood movie with these stars in a known genre that was very popular at the time. And it hadn't got a cinema release. So I was eager to rent it, and I did. And I remember watching it, and I absolutely loved it. It has flaws because of the process that it went through with Paramount. It was heavily cut. Bruce was prevailed upon to trim down. I think he had a 2 hours 20-minute cut, and it went down to just under 2 hours. And I watched this thing, and I just loved it. I loved the look of it. It was shot by the great Conrad Hall, so it has this very dark look. It's almost entirely raining throughout the picture. The cast is great, especially John Malkovich is an FBI agent who enters quite late in the narrative and completely hijacks the story. He's just so fantastic. The dialogue is, being Bruce Robinson, is of a very high order for a serial killer movie. There's a lot of quite weighty themes knocking around in there. And I was just really, I had this sort of moment of insight, which is I sort of managed to draw a parallel between it and Widnall, which is in the sense Andy Garcia's cop is transferred from LA to Eureka up in the wilds of California because he's burnt out in LA. But of course, he goes from the city to the country thinking that everything's going to be fine, and it's not, which in a sense is a bit like Widnall. So I wrote this little essay.
I've gone on to a murder investigation by mistake.
Yes, exactly. So I wrote this little essay. And then several years later, when I was at Bristol University, I came across one day on the train when I was heading back at the start of spring term 96. I read a letter in the paper sent by a Bruce Robinson, and there was a kind of partial address next to this. I mean, these days you can just look people up on the internet, but then, you couldn't. And the tone of this letter made me think, that sounds like Bruce Robinson, the Bruce Robinson. So I wrote him a letter. I don't know whether you are the Bruce Robinson. If you're not, then please discard this letter immediately. And if you are, I'm a big fan. I'm at Bristol Uni. Widnall was about to be re-released at that point. I think I may have started doing some film reviews or what have you for the Bristol student newspaper. And so I basically said, can I interview you about Widnall and your career for Epigram, the student newspaper? And he wrote back this wonderful letter, which I still have. And I opened it up and it says, "Thank you for your letter, and I'm blind fucking angry." That's my first introduction. Brackets, not with you, but with the rag for printing my address. And he goes on to, basically say, yes, I'm happy to talk. Here's my writing room number. And by the way, Spielberg was on it a week ago telling me he's not going to direct my latest script. It was like being given privileged access into some strange corner of Hollywood. It's typed on his wonderful old IBM Selectric typewriter, which I became very familiar with when I was interviewing him. So I interviewed him face to face about Widnall and his career. That came out in the student newspaper. We stayed in touch. I interviewed him again for The Observer after I'd graduated. One of those kind of is it Parry Match, who do those Q&As with, no, Paris Review. Anyway, they wanted one of these Q&A type things done to coincide with the publication of his novel, The Peculiar Memories of Thomas Penman. And then I unearthed that essay from my abortive dictionary, and I thought, you know what? Book of interviews. This was at the time when Faber was doing a lot of these Q&A books, Scorsese on Scorsese, Schrader on Schrader, Gilliam on Gilliam, I think had already come out, and I'd reviewed. And I just thought, Bruce Robinson's tailor-made for this kind of book. So I sent him a letter basically pitching it. And he wrote back, and to this day, I'm not really sure whether he actually was saying yes to doing the book or not. "Thanks for your letter and forgive the short reply. I'm drowning in an unpleasantness I'm too fucked to describe." Gives me a contact at Bloomsbury and says he'll help out if he can. So he never actually said yes to doing the book. We just ended up doing the book.
I guess an absence of fuck off is a yes from Bruce Robinson. I mean, I think he would tell you in no uncertain terms if he didn't want to do it.
Absolutely. So then we entered a kind of protracted period where we were trying to thrash out the contract. I wasn't paid a hell of a lot of money. I still don't know how I turned it around, because I unearthed the cassettes, the little Sony micro cassettes that I recorded the interviews on in my parents' attic some months back, and they're all neatly labeled with dates and what we talked about in those interviews. And we did our first interview talking about Penman, in fact, on the 23rd of November 1999, and the book came out on the 20th of November the next year.
Whoa, that's crazy. That's a crazy turnaround.
I know. I don't even know how I did it. I completed the final interview in May 2000 after the original delivery date.
Right.
I couldn't do that now. I just don't. I mean, I was flying by wire. It's no wonder that the book has a few infelicities, let's say, in terms of its editing. But his conversation, well, the Guardian said Robinson's conversation is a work of art, and yes, obviously I intervened to make it readable and obviously make myself look good in the questions, but he is, you know, he really has a use of language that is as unique as Dickens, and the way he expresses himself, whether verbally or in the, you know, extracts of those letters I just read to you, it was gift after gift after gift after gift. He hadn't done a huge amount in terms of produced work, so the book kind of structured itself. We were able to, every chapter was a deep dive into one thing that he'd done, starting with his acting career, chapter 1 ending with just at the point where he'd been hired by Putnam to write Killing Fields, chapter 2 Killing Fields, chapter 3 Fat Man and Little Boy, his atomic bomb script, which he became completely obsessed with, and actually so did I, and still am as a result of talking to him about it. Then Widnall, which of course has been raked over many, many times, but you know, it was enjoyable to talk about. How to Get Ahead in Advertising, Jennifer 8, the 2 films he wrote as a screenwriter for hire in the 90s, Return to Paradise and In Dreams, neither of which were very close to his original script. Penman, and then a kind of wrap-up chapter which covered all kinds of things, including his, at that point, just starting to be written Jack the Ripper book, which in the end took something like 12 years to research and write, went through 2 publishers, and came out a few years ago. They All Love Jack, which again, one writer described it as like the love child of David Starkey and Johnny Rotten. And funnily enough, that is an accurate description. It's an amazing book. It was much longer. I remember him saying I had to just stop at a certain point. It's already like 800-900 pages or something, and I think he had twice as much material. So yeah, I mean, it was sort of an accident. It was an accident that I saw the letter. It was a moment of unusual proactivity on my part, just dropping him a letter, and then again for the Observer, and then again proposing the book. It was a sort of vagueness on his part, saying, yeah, whatever, here's the person to contact at Bloomsbury. And then I suppose this mad rush of actually doing the interviews. 6 weekends I spent at his farmhouse in Herefordshire, sort of, you know, staying overnight, session on the Saturday, session on the Sunday, all fueled by red wine, periodic trips into Hay and Wye in his silver Aston Martin DB5. Some pot was smoked at one point. I mean, it was, you know, really, I think there are probably Widnall fans who would have paid Bloomsbury to have the experience that I had the pleasure of having between, you know, at the age of 24.
Yeah, I was going to say, you said earlier I wasn't well paid for it, but you kind of were.
Well, he's like the godfather of my career in a way. Had I not done that book, I really don't know where I would be right now. Maybe I would have gone on a different path and have different books under my belt. Who knows? But it opened doors. Unquestionably, it opened doors. And I found I enjoyed the process. I had more time to do the second one. I had more time to do the third one. And, you know, I sort of got good at it after a period of time. The book started to sell fewer, which of course is ironic. The most rushed is the one that sells the most copies. The one you're proudest of is the one that sells the least. But hey, I'm proud of it. That's my book on Christopher Hampton, which was my third book for Faber.
I just want to go back to the Jack the Ripper book. Was it Everybody Loves Jack? Is that the title?
They All Love Jack.
They All Love
I think
Jack.
It's the title of a popular song of the time.
Yeah. That is an amazing book. I mean, it's just it's so off the wall and obsessed and full of I mean, he basically goes to war with the whole sort of Ripper industry and has his own
and the British establishment.
Yes.
He takes the whole thing to pieces. His central premise really is that this notion that there is this big mystery surrounding the Ripper is bollocks. That it has suited the establishment, particularly the Masons, to draw this veil of mystery over this chap's heinous activities, because in the end he was one of them, and fairly provably so. I think he's nailed him. I've read a bit of stuff on the Ripper over the years. He's you know, obviously it's a fascinating case. Bruce is a phenomenal researcher. I learned that from talking to him about the atomic bomb. He'd written The Killing Fields by that point. He then was doing another project with David Putnam. He was hired by Putnam. Hugh Hudson was originally going to direct the movie, to write a film about the development of the atomic bomb. It was for Warner Brothers, who had a Warner Brothers research budget, and he basically carved into that for about a year, sending off freedom of information requests to all different branches of the US government. And the stuff he got back was jaw-dropping, startling. I mean, he must have boxes and boxes and boxes of this stuff in his attic, including interviews with key players like the head of G2 security for the Manhattan Project. And he found all kinds of stuff, which is sort of in the public domain now, but still not really disseminated. The notion that the Nazis were developing an atomic bomb is still pretty much current. And I'm convinced from talking to Bruce that it, again, was absolute bollocks. According to him, in the official record, it said that the Nazis, that a threat of a Nazi bomb had receded before the Manhattan Project even got underway. The Manhattan Project was nothing to do with Germany. It was everything to do with Japan, and it was even more to do with the Soviet Union. The two bombs were dropped, Fat Man and Little Boy, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, either side of the proposed Russian invasion date of Japan. In other words, so right at the end of the war, the Russians basically declared war on Japan, assuming they were going to go in there and grab some territory. And those two bombs were the Americans saying, "Don't you dare." We have got the biggest stick in the playground now, and we're not afraid to use it. And he found out all kinds of stuff about Oppenheimer's lover, Jean Tatlock, and her mysterious death. I mean, there was more material that he told me than I could put in the book. It's still one of my favorite chapters in the book because I think it's so fascinating. And he applied that same research to the Ripper times, 6, sort of 10 even. I think it was about a year's research for Fat Man and Little Boy, and must have been a decade's worth for the Ripper. And reading it through, despite its discursive style, it's probably the most profane nonfiction book I've ever read. I think he's nailed him. I really do think he's nailed him. The correlation between this guy, who is a musical singer, his touring around the country, the Ripper letters, many of which were discounted as fakes, and he claims are not. It's pretty compelling circumstantial evidence, put it that way. I've only read it once. I've dipped into it occasionally. I started rereading it again a few months ago, and its depiction of London and the Metropolitan Police and the royal family. It was just stunningly up to date. He could have been writing it now, really. And that's why when I learned he was writing it, I was always very excited. From the moment we talked about it for Smoking in Bed, I thought this is going to be great, because he's a huge fan of Dickens, which is, the quintessential Victorian novelist. He's written about serial killers before, most notably in Jennifer 8, but he also had written some other unproduced screenplays in his early years about other serial killers. And this is going to be like a top to bottom look at Victorian society, filtered through his particular angry, scabrous sensibility and writing style. And so it proved. I don't think even I had anticipated quite how scabrous it would be. But yeah, you're quite right. He goes to war on the Ripper industry and the British establishment. And it's sometimes sort of thrilling to read, actually.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to read. I love that book. It's so. I think that's one of the things with Robinson that comes out in your book as well, is that there's this, that With Nell and I, as brilliant as it is, kind of does him a disservice, because it gives this impression of a sort of louche, alcohol-sodden intelligence. Whereas he's so much more engaged with the world, he's so much more engaged with history, I guess, that idea of The Killing Fields was, you mentioned a hole in the wall video rental place. For us, it was the garage, the Shell garage on Isle of Hill. And we'd go to this petrol station to rent videos. They had like red stickers were £2.50 and blue stickers were £1 or something like that. And it was, and when we first bought our very first video recorder, The Killing Fields was the first film my mum and dad went down. We're going to go and get a film to try it out, and came back with The Killing Fields. And it was like, okay. So like we were all kids, all right, and that's what
it's a pretty startling. I mean, it's not exactly what you call fancy Friday night entertainment. Killing Fields.
It was literally our Saturday night movie. It was literally our first VHS cassette was The Killing Fields. But that just shows a level of engagement and responsibility. You don't approach the Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge regime, and the massacres and the genocide with a sort of like, another glass of wine and, a witty one-liner,
No, and indeed, Bruce says in the book that he in response to a question or a prompt from me, that he thinks it was actually good writer casting on David Putnam's part.
Right.
I think David Putnam, I have an enormous respect for David Putnam. I would go so far as to say Putnam and his style of filmmaking, the kinds of movies he produced in the British film industry in the 80s, are one of the reasons why I wanted to be a screenwriter. I was interested in movies in the first place. Popular, politically engaged entertainment. They weren't always successful, films like The Mission, but commercially successful, but artistically, The Killing Fields, The Mission, they're going through to things like Memphis Belle. He lived and breathed British cinema, and yes, he did have a great feel for casting Bruce as the writer in that case. A huge flyer. I mean, he'd been writing stuff for Putnam for a while, kind of on a retainer, but nothing of that scale. And as Bruce himself says in the book, it was the article, I can't remember which newspaper it was in. It was one of those articles that gets optioned, the Death and Life of Dith Pran, I think, by Sidney Schoenberg. And as Bruce says, you might reasonably have expected that a big name screenwriter of the time, William Goldman, would be a logical choice to adapt material like that. I mean, William Goldman actually would have been the most logical choice, given that he'd done something like All the President's Men. That's the wrangling of non-fiction, which is one of my all-time favorites. That wrangling of complicated non-fiction into gripping dramatic entertainment. But Putnam knew Bruce, and I think it was probably because of Bruce's political engagement that he wanted him on the project. Now, I read the first draft. It's striking, actually, how similar the final film is to the initial drafts. There were some cuts. The script is bigger and more brutal, as I recall, in its opening. What I do remember vividly is so one of the sequences, if you remember The Killing Fields, one of the sequences people are most likely to remember is the sequence where after Schoenberg has left Cambodia and is back in New York, he's watching TV news footage of the B-52s dropping bombs on Cambodia, and it's scored with Nessun Dorma. A brilliant piece of cinema, and he's kind of sort of shrinking into his seat watching this. And I remember reading that section of the screenplay, and I in fact I think it's quoted in the documentary that Adrian Sibley did for Channel 4, which was one of my inspirations to do the book, The Peculiar Memories of Bruce Robinson. And the line in the script is something like, the B-52s drop their filth on a jungle landscape. And he has an ability to drop their filth, because it is, you look at these planes and it is like they're shitting all over the country. I can't think of another screenwriter, maybe Sarah Phelps, who would choose to write something in that way. And if you read the screenplays, they're great big chunky paragraphs of description, and they're full of his voice. And the same was true of Fat Man and Little Boy, which I read in its original draft. It was then multiply rewritten, including by Roland Joffe who ultimately directed the picture for Paramount. And these screenplays are so dense, and I could kind of see why, if you didn't have the protection of someone like Putnam, that a screenplay of that kind would get mangled, because it's so individual. It's so, I mean, the number of screenwriting rules that they must break intrinsically. I mean, he knows his stuff, structure and character and all that stuff, but they are just written in a way that is, I've very rarely encountered reading screenplays.
I sometimes wonder if someone like Bruce Robinson might be a problem for screenwriters who are starting out, because they're so confident and it's just like, the reason he can get away with all of this is because he's Bruce Robinson and you're not, it's so it's like, how much can I learn from, I remember reading The Withnail and I think similarly to you mentioned it in the book that you've got a copy free with Sight and Sound, and I think that's
still got it.
Yeah,
my signed copy.
And I went to see Ian Banks do a reading at Liverpool, and everyone queued up to get their book signed at the end, and everyone had brand new copies of whatever the book was he was touring. And I had an old, very, very, very old copy of The Wasp Factory that had been through 20 odd hands, and I thought, I'm a bit embarrassed now. I'm going to get to the front and he's going to look at this and go, what the, don't buy a new copy. And he took it and he loved it. He was like, oh my God, how many people have read this? It's like, so many people have read this. But yeah, anyway, sorry, that in Withnail and I, you have that famous opening line about hell being a room with, no chairs. A chair in. Yeah.
This room has 2 chairs or something. This room has 3 chairs. Yes.
I mean, I love reading those things, but I would, hesitate if I'm writing my screenplay. I would sort of be worried about, if I put something in like that, will I be flippant, or will it be, who is this guy? Who does he think he is? That there's a real, his personality just shines through.
I mean, I suppose I have a view on that, although maybe whether it's the correct view or not, given that I'm still an unproduced screenwriter with a day job, who can say. I think if you new to yourself at that point, then you're lost already. I think you have to write whatever your voice is telling, you have to write whatever you want to write, what you want to see, and you have to write it in your voice. And if your voice happens to be as scabrous as Bruce Robinson's, well, I would really, that should stand you in better stead than something that feels neutrally crafted. I've got several major screenwriting manuals that I've just never read. I've never read Sid Field. I've never read Robert McKee's story. I've got them. I've bought them in charity shops, mint copies over the years. I must read that at some point. And I never do, because I'm slightly worried about losing the spontaneity of whatever it is I'm up to.
Do you feel that way about having conversations with screenwriters as well, to some degree? I mean, you said earlier you love, you learn a lot and you love, but is there also a slight, because I mean, we're all a bunch of superstitious people, aren't we, writers at heart? You don't want to tamper too much with the thing that motivates you.
Well, the thing about interviews is they're rarely didactic. And there is something slightly didactic, I find, or prescriptive about these screenwriting manuals. You have to hit this on page 10 and you shouldn't do your scene straps in bold and, whatever the rules are. Robert McKee's tone of voice is very kind of, this is the way it is. Whereas individual writers, they're more often not, this is what works for me. I'm not necessarily it works for everyone, and you can take it or leave it. And actually seeing 10 writers in a book, as with my second book, Story and Character, Interviews with British Screenwriters, or 12 writers in a book, as with The Art of Screen Adaptation, you kind of get, as I say, you get to do a compare and contrast. Oh, he does it this way, she does it that way. So that one suits me more, or this one suits me more. Maybe I should do a kind of pick and mix and match. Yes. So I that's why I think I prefer interviews with writers to books about how to write, I think. Or to put it another way, I have learned a lot about how to write from interviewing writers. I write differently now because I talk to Bruce. Bruce, for example, absolutely hates the use of we in a screenplay. Now, most screenwriters use we being the audience, we being the camera. But I've never been that fond of it. And I think that's partly because sort of Bruce made me unfond of it at an early age. And I do try to avoid it. I use it if I have to, but if I can find a way around it, then I will. Many of the things that he mentions in the book, I mean, actually, it almost is a screenwriting manual. If you take it soup to nuts and you fillet it, I'm doing one now, my 5th interview book with the novelist and screenwriter William Boyd.
Right.
And it's the same structure. It's working chronologically through his work, more or less. It's not a how to write a novel, but there's loads of advice in there from a best-selling novelist of long standing of how to write a novel. And that's one of the kind of nice things about interviewing one person. The same is true of Christopher Hampton. A lot of stuff in there. I've never had the pleasure of doing a non-fiction screenplay, but if I did, he very much believes that the closer you stick to fact, the better, because fact is what has animated the non-fiction project in the first place, and fact will always give you presents and gifts that fictionalizing won't. And he has sometimes taken a long time over non-fiction projects. His play, The Talking Cure, for example, took him quite a long time to write because, in his wonderful phrase, the facts are extremely inconveniently organized. And so he had to figure out a way to make history work dramatically. In the end, I think he did have to bend and cheat slightly, but you see so many non-fiction projects are very popular these days. But the ones I love most are the ones where you really get the sense that what you're watching is accurate. Something like Spotlight, for example, which is partly due to Tom McCarthy's direction, where he's shrewdly worked out that this is upsetting, potentially melodramatic material. And really what he needs to do as a writer-director is to tell it as straightforwardly and factually as possible and get out of its way. It has a feeling of a 1970s Sidney Lumet film, which in my book is pretty much the highest praise there is.
The gold standard.
And that film feels utterly authentic. Although it's much more big and bold and at times melodramatic, Michael Mann's The Insider feels extremely authentic. And All the President's Men feels extremely authentic. So, but I've learned that. I listened to Christopher talking about nonfiction projects, and I thought, you know what, I agree with that. I remember going to see The Theory of Everything and enjoying it. It's an extremely well-crafted film. And I came away, I remember saying to my girlfriend at the time, well, that was brilliant. It was sort of a Hollywood illness picture, which just happened to have at its heart someone called Stephen Hawking. And I tell you what, if I'd been hired to write that script, I'd have turned in a very factually based first draft. They'd have wanted all kinds of changes, which would have been nothing to do with history. I would have said, I'm afraid I can't do that. And I'd have got fired. So I really admire the craft of being able to write it, but I couldn't necessarily, or my draft would be, very different. And that's sort of what the thing Bruce had with Fat Man and Little Boy. He did his research. He wrote a very factually based script. It was very dense. It was quite challenging. David Putnam moved on to other projects. Hugh Hudson moved on to other projects. It fell into... so it was originally going to be Putnam and Hudson. It became Tony Garnett and Roland Joffe for Paramount. Bruce wasn't involved. They didn't have access to Bruce's research. They didn't know why he'd written certain things the way he'd written them. They took a stab at it. I like it as a film. I think it's a good film. Bruce hates it, as in, you haven't even seen it, as far as I know. He saw the first 10 minutes or 20 minutes on video or something and then slung it across the room. But Bruce's draft would be the accurate draft, but that's not the draft that got made.
Yeah, I find myself always, well, we're talking at the moment, and the blonde storm is raging outside as we speak, like a forest fire. And I would defend that film to a certain degree because it is a it's based on a novel, so I think it is a work of fiction, and it's very generically marked as this is not reality, no matter how it's being marketed, which is a different. But at the same time, I have a lot of sympathy for the argument on the other side, because I do feel that at times I'll watch a film like The Imitation Game and get sort of angry at the liberties taken just because you need that Robert McPhee antagonist, and it's like, okay, there's no antagonist in the movie, so we're going to make one of the guys who is actually the Charles Dance character, who's actually responsible for sort of nurturing these people, these difficult mathematicians and scientists, but we're going to make him into the asshole just because we need an asshole,
Funnily, it's very strange that you should mention that picture, because I had a real problem with that one when it came out. I've grown to like it more. I saw it just the other day, and for the first time I actually really rather enjoyed it. But I think it's one of those films where it's best just to regard it as a war film, a home front sort of, espionage war film, rather than anything based on fact, particularly because I think the thing about him being suspected of being a spy, I seem to recall, was not true, was made up for the purposes of the movie. And you think, this is a man that had all kinds of shit heaped on him by the authorities when he was alive. And the film is basically very respectful of him, but you've added to that. And I had a real problem with that in a slightly high horsey principled way when the film was released. Not that I know, I've never read a biog of Turing, so it's kind of secondhand outrage. But so yeah, I can also see both sides of that. But that was very clearly this is based on a true story. I understand the difference with Blonde. I think if you're adapting a novel about something real, but it's a fictionalized version of something real, and your film is therefore an adaptation of a fictionalized version of something real, expecting that to be accurate, you're probably expecting the wrong thing.
I think sometimes it's to do with the way it's marketed. There was a recent film with Elizabeth Moss called Shirley. It's about Shirley Jackson, essentially. And she's Shirley Jackson and with her husband, and it's based on a novel. And the novel is kind of like almost a homage to Jackson in creating a sort of gothic thriller where she might be a murderer and stuff like that. But the film has been reviewed and has been marketed entirely as this is a Shirley Jackson biopic. And it's just like, no, it's not. She didn't murder anyone, guys. It's not even like there's a sort of like, oh, maybe that's just a complete, it's a novel, so I don't know.
That would be like taking the John Cusack film about Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, where he's investigating a serial killer as fact. I mean, come on.
Did Edgar Allan Poe investigate serial killers? Is that actually true? Exactly, absolutely, exactly. It's funny. It is funny, this thing, because it is. I mean, reading through these writers, you get a real brilliant sense of how everybody has their own rules and has their own sort of things. But it's always, it often comes down to sort of ethical decisions of what, especially in terms of adaptation of non-fiction sources, of what do I owe the story and what do I owe the audience? What do I owe what do I owe reality and what do I owe the story? Might be a better way of phrasing it.
I think that's exactly the dilemma. It's squaring that circle or charting a course between those poles is where the non-fiction adaptation, or where I would say where the key decisions lie. I say I've never written one. I did start writing one on the spec just for my own amusement.
What was it about?
It was actually an adaptation of Stephen Bach's Final Cut, Dreams and Disaster in the Making of Heaven's Gate.
Wow.
I wrote a sort of the first 5 pages or so. I tried to track down the rights, but it sort of led to a dead end. And I mean, I found myself taking liberties even within the first 5 pages. So it's a tough one to chart. I do love nonfiction movies, though. Many of the films I have most enjoyed in the past few years have been non-fiction, often with a political slant, and not sometimes films people don't talk about very much. The Todd Haynes film Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo and Tim Robbins is absolutely sensational, but it makes no concessions whatsoever to conventional audience-pleasing courtroom drama. It is dour. It is, 20 minutes in, you feel like you've been slugged in the gut. But for me, that's high praise. Again, it feels like a movie of the 1970s. In fact, it's interesting how many of the directors or films that I like are clearly influenced by films of the 1970s. American, that fantastic era of American cinema, where, with directors like Coppola and Scorsese and Alan Pakula, his paranoid movies of the 70s, All the President's Men, Clute, The Parallax View. These have always been some of my favorite movies, and it is interesting to see the impact of 70s movies in of directors like Fincher, for example. They're drawing on that last sort of moment of real auteur driven cinema. But I think non-fiction stuff has this, it is the true story thing. It has a weight. I do think that being based on a true story lends something a weight. What you then have to do is try, I would say, not to neuter the story too much, lest you lose the weight.
I think that's often to do with those cliched moments. The things that make me cringe the most are the sort of, Vincent, come over here. I want you to meet Mr. Gauguin. Paul, this is Monsieur Van Gogh. And it's just that those kind of moments, or there's a bit in Mindhunter, the David Fincher sort of serial killer thing, where they come up with the name serial killer. And it's sort of like, we should call it sequence killer. Doesn't sound quite right. Is there another word we could use? Well, I was having breakfast cereal this morning, and it came to that they don't say that, but it has that same sort. And the theory of everything has that as well. It has moments where it's kind of the eureka moment. How do you visualize something which is actually non-verbal, non-visual?
Yes.
Ron Howard in A Beautiful Mind, as soon as he gets John Nash writing on window panes, I think that's brilliant. That's a brilliant solution, because writing on a blackboard, boring. Writing on a video window pane, I can film it from the other side. I can see his face, and it's odd, so it goes with his character.
Exactly. I think it's the character thing. If you can find something like that also illuminates character, he's unpredictable. He will do the unconventional thing, and it's visually interesting, as you say. Then you've kind of doubled your money there.
Yeah, absolutely. So you went from writing about Bruce Robinson and interviewing Bruce, which as you say, he's your godfather, and he's your the font from which all else flows now. How did you sort of move on to the other big name in your sort of bibliography so far, Christopher Hampton? I mean, he's kind of, in some ways, they're kind of connected, right?
Yes. Well, I actually approached Christopher to be in Story and Character. I had no sense after the Bruce, so I was in a very lucky position. I may have embroidered this in my memory over time, but I sort of remember Bloomsbury, they were really, really happy with Smoking in Bed. It sold pretty well for that kind of book. Reviews were amazing, and they more or less said, what do you want to do next, which is what every author, non-fiction author, would love to be in. And I said, well, nobody's done an anthology of interviews with British screenwriters, which they hadn't. And
did their faces drop at that moment? Did they go,
No, I think they were really up for it, actually.
Good.
I presented them with a list. I sort of drew up a list which had about 30 names on it, of people who were big at the time, or who interested me in one way or another. I had no sense of how easy or difficult it might be to talk to these guys. So rather than doing a kind of A, B, and C and writing in waves, I wrote to pretty much everyone at once, which then gave me the opposite problem than I was expecting, because I think I wrote to 27 writers and I got 24 yeses.
Oh, wow.
Which I just wasn't expecting. And I think I had maybe 18 months or 2 years to do this one, rather than the ridiculous turnaround from the Bruce book. But even so, I had writers on board that I had to lose. I had actually done interviews that I had to lose, which was painful and embarrassing, to get it down to something that was deliverable. And one of those writers I had approached was Christopher Hampton. And I was sort of looking at my list, probably thinking, how do I cut this down?
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Hey, it's Mark Marin from WTF, here to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. And I'm sure the reason you're listening to this podcast right now is because you chose it. Well, choose Progressive's Name Your Price tool, and you could find insurance options that fit your budget, so you can pick the best one for your situation. Who doesn't like choice? Try it at Progressive.com. And now, some legal info. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
And I suddenly thought, hold on a minute. He's a distinguished playwright. He's a distinguished screenwriter. He's got a career. You know, he had a play in the West End at the age of about 18 or something. This guy's a book on his own. He was published by Faber. So I dropped him a letter and I said, look, you know, how would you feel about me taking you out of this book and just doing a book just with you? And he said, well, I'd be happy to do that. Why don't you go talk to Faber? So having approached Bruce, and Bruce is like, oh yeah, go and talk to Bloomsbury. And Owen with Christopher is like, go and talk to Faber. It's the 3 easiest books anyone ever had to pitch. I was totally spoiled. And Faber, as Bloomsbury had been, were thrilled with that idea. Obviously, it wasn't going to be an expensive book, although I was paid more to do that than I was to do either of my last 2 books. So fees are clearly going down precipitously. And it was immensely civilized. I thoroughly enjoyed visiting Bruce at his house, although it's slightly odd. You know, I didn't really know his wife and kids, and I think they'd seen quite a lot of hacks come through and interview Bruce over the years. So, you know, they made me welcome, but you always feel slightly on the outside. In fact, there was one wonderful moment where Bruce had a friend over and they were sitting at the kitchen table in this big farmhouse kitchen, and I was sitting on the sofa, and he and his friend were smoking pot and talking to each other in French. It was like the scene from Widnall, where Widnall and Monty are doing that, and Marwood is like, I don't understand a word of this. What are they saying? It was very strange. Anyway, it wasn't being done deliberately. Clearly, it was just anyway. And the thing with the process with Christopher was equally lovely. I was living in Bristol at the time, so I'd get the National Express coach up quite early in the morning. I'd rock up at his. He writes in a flat at one end of Kensington Park Gardens. And has a house at the other end. And so I would rock up there and we'd do sort of a couple of hours of yak. And then he'd take me for a lunch to his favourite Italian restaurant in Notting Hill. Out would come the American Express card. And then we'd back for another couple of hours of yak. And then I'd get the bus back. And we did that, you know, intermittently over the course of a couple of years. He kept writing things. So this was problematic from my point of view, because it was a bit like that wonderful shot towards the end of Poltergeist where she goes up the stairs and you have that fantastic reverse dolly zoom and the corridor just gets longer and longer and longer in front of her. That's what doing this book felt like at a certain point, because he kept writing stuff that I had to talk to him about, because he's a very fast, a very prolific writer, and the quality of what I'm totally in awe of Christopher, as I am in awe of Bruce, but in a completely different way. They are very different writers, both immense talents. That came out in 2005. And I'm immensely proud of it. Unfortunately, it came out in what I would call an uncommercial year for him. He didn't have a play out. His most recent film, his third directorial effort, Imagining Argentina, with Antonio Banderas and Emma Thompson, had not been a box office success. Unfairly, I think. I think it's a very interesting movie, very heartfelt, really unusual. And so, and because it sort of was part film book, part theatre book, I think it wasn't. I think it was tricky to market. And by that point, the whole Faber Directors on Directors series, which this was notionally part of, Hampton on Hampton, was sort of starting to tail off. I think publishing had got harder. I think I have a theory that the DVD commentary track had to some extent started to render this kind of book, certainly with directors, like not redundant exactly, but you could quite often hear what someone had to say about a project, take a deep dive on a project simply by turning on the commentary track of the disc. And so it's still the book of mine to date that I possibly am proudest of, simply on a technical level, because it took me 3 books to work out actually really how to do the editing and do it really well.
Right.
I turned in a book, because I had the time to do it, I turned in a book to Faber that if I'd never seen it again, from the moment I turned in the finished manuscript to when it came out between covers, I would have still have been perfectly happy with it. Which is quite a good note if you've got the time to do it. Handing in a book where you know you're going to have to still do work close to deadline once it's been typeset, which was the case with Smoking in Bed. Don't do that. That's my piece of advice there. And then, kind of silence fell, really. I had a couple of ideas for other interview books, which Faber were interested in, but the interviewees weren't. And I thought I'd probably done my last one. And then many years later, Creative Essentials had approached a friend of mine to ask if he would like to do a book about how to do screen adaptation, and he was unavailable. So he recommended me. And I said, well, I'm fascinated by the subject, but I don't think I'm arrogant enough to write a book telling anyone how to write a screen adaptation when I haven't had one produced. But I tell you what I will do. I'll round up a dozen or so screenwriters who have done adaptation, and we'll talk to them, and that'll effectively be a kind of how-to book by the back door. And they loved that idea. An adaptation, if you will, of their original pitch. And so I got to talk to all these fantastic guys. I wrote a couple of people I talked to before back in, including Christopher. When I did Hampton on Hampton, he had written the play The Talking Cure, which had some interest from David Cronenberg to make into a film, but that hadn't happened. And he'd also written the initial drafts of Atonement for Richard Eyre to direct. But of course, both projects had then had a fascinating afterlife and had reached the screen. The Talking Cure is A Dangerous Method, directed by Cronenberg, and Atonement with a completely different director, Joe Wright. And so what I did there was I took the relevant sections from Faber, from the Faber book with credit, put them in the screen adaptation book, and then effectively brought both stories up to date, which was kind of fascinating because I think Atonement's a truly magnificent adaptation. And Hossein Amini, who I'd interviewed for Story and Character, who's, I think, one of Britain's most distinguished screenwriters and a great advocate for adaptation. In fact, he mainly does adaptation, although the biggest thing he did recently was McMafia, which, that was an adaptation, although it's a very free adaptation of that nonfiction book. So it was lovely to be able to talk to him again and talk about some of the more recent things he'd done, like Drive, and his own film that he directed, Two Faces of January. And many of those other writers in there are people I'd admired from afar for a long time. I was thrilled to get David Nichols, for example, who's one of my favorite authors, and he was just lovely. Sarah Phelps, as I said, was just hilarious. All of them, everyone in it was just a pleasure to talk to in their very different ways. Olivia Hattried, as I said, was lovely enough to hook me up with the Writers Guild. So I did a lot of those online Q&As, which was a nice way to spend a bit of lockdown. And Jeremy Brock, who was my first interviewee, the writer of, adapter of Last King of Scotland, writer of Mrs. Brown, he and I got on like a house on fire, and we started developing a project together, which is actually the second time I've done that. I did the same with one of the writers from Story and Character, Rupert Walters. Working with a more experienced screenwriter, especially if you're picking up a project of theirs, like a spec script that died and you're reviving it, it's lovely, actually. And I hope to be able to do it again, either with someone new or to do new projects with them. So in a strange way, although I absolutely categorically never set out to do these books as a way of advancing my screenwriting career, it didn't even occur to me. I have got on well with people enough that I've felt confident enough to say, you got anything lying around that you might want me to, have a spec crack at? And some of those things, the script with Rupert Walters is one of possibly the screenplay I'm proudest of. The outline for the project I did with Jeremy, which unfortunately is slightly hit a brick wall, as things tend to do in the industry, I'm just, again, immensely proud of. We get on like a house on fire. I hope we do something else together. So the two things are kind of now slightly working in tandem. Yeah, I kind of hope I'll do another one at some. Well, I'm doing the William Boyd book, which has been, again, a long-term project, much like Hampton, paused for lockdown. We did almost the entire thing by Zoom, which I remember meeting him. We had a kind of pre-book lunch at the Chelsea Arts Club, which he's a member of. And I remember walking back to the Tube. This was in February 2020. And I remember walking back to the Tube, it was South Ken, I think, heading down into the crowds and thinking to myself vaguely, I wonder whether this COVID thing's going to amount to anything. A month later, of course, I was out of London and we were in lockdown. So we paused the book, and then effectively realized we weren't going to be able to pause it any longer because this thing could just continue for ages, and did the whole thing by Zoom, which actually worked fine because I knew him well enough that, it didn't impede our progress. We did the final interview face-to-face at his home where I'd first interviewed him for Story and Character all those years ago, like 20 years ago, on his most recent novel. And I'm due to deliver that to Penguin in January, and it comes out next November.
It's so interesting that we're talking about also the sort of collaboration, because I think screenwriting, more than any other form of writing, probably has elements of either actual collaboration where two people are working on the same project, or two or more people, or a sort of implied collaboration that if you write it as a sole voice, somebody else is very likely going to take it on. And even if you write and direct it, you're going to have actors who are going to interpret your things, a cinematographer who's going to light it in a way that you weren't maybe expecting, or so it is the form of writing more than, say, the novel, more than, even though I would also underline that sort of things like novels and everything, often pass through more than one pair of hands anyway, or certainly more than one pair of eyes. Agents, editors, loved ones,
course,
friends, So I mean, but screenwriting seems to just have that written into its DNA, so both for the good and the bad.
Absolutely. And if you're not up for that, then don't do it. Bruce is very uncompromising. Right. Again, I remember a line from the Peculiar Memories of Bruce Robinson, the Adrian Sibley documentary. They're interviewing John Calley, who was producer at Warner Brothers for a long time, and then I think a producer at Columbia. And he said, you don't hire Bruce to write your script, you hire Bruce to write Bruce's script. And I think that's true. And he doesn't necessarily suffer fools gladly. And actually, I admire that. I sometimes feel maybe writers should stick up for themselves more, but producers and directors are powerful people, and they have valid opinions, and films cost money. You can sit down and write a novel, you can span the globe and centuries, and it costs you nothing more than the pad and the pen, or printing it out. If you make a film, then you are subject to the vagaries of the marketplace. And even Widnor, as is well known, the production process was not necessarily an easy one. He kind of managed to wiggle through the middle of Handmade, who were a slightly hand-to-mouth outfit, really. And he had to finance some of the film himself at the back end. There were a couple of scenes or shooting days that he had to stump up the money for because Handmade wouldn't. So even on the film that is considered his biggest success and his most typical of him, was not an easy film to make. Jennifer 8 was a very unpleasant film to make. Again, it's one of my favorite chapters in the book. And that's partly due to interference and yes, you have to be okay with that. The extent to which you can put up with that over a very long period. I know writers, I'm friendly with writers, I follow writers on Twitter who get knockback after knockback after knockback, notes after notes after notes. And at a certain point, you just have to say no, I think. I was very pleased that I finally got round to writing a short novel because it slightly got the screenwriting monkey off my back. I never thought I could do long form prose fiction. I was thrilled to find that I could. I'm very keen to write another one. And funnily enough, it recharged my batteries when I did finally come back to write scripts, because I've been writing, shackled to the final draft screenwriting program for so long that actually sitting down with a moleskin notebook and a pencil and just writing a novel, and there's no difference between that process and, the way John le Carre wrote or the way William Boyd writes. I felt so connected to the writing. And having done it, I was able to approach screenwriting again with a slightly lighter heart, but also a sense that it's no longer the be-all and end-all. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. There's two different kinds of collaboration. I think collaboration with other writers at the writing stage is pure pleasure. I've always enjoyed it, and it's been done in very different ways. When I rewrote. So the script of Rupert Walters that I rewrote was an epic historical drama set at the time of the Gunpowder Plot. And I sort of more or less told him what I was going to do. I didn't do an outline. I just then went away and did it. He didn't interfere at all. He then read my draft, said, well, as far as I'm concerned, this is now the draft. My drafts don't exist, which I was immensely flattered by. He then went through a series of sort of revisions and notes from him to me over a period of time. He then signed off on it. His agent signed off on it. I managed to get an agent on the strength of it, which again was a thrilling moment for me. And off we went out into the industry with it. In the case of the Jeremy Brock project, again, there was an existing screenplay, a feature script, another epic historical yarn. By now, I was wise to this. I said, as a feature, this may be problematic, but as a TV series, why don't we see if we can turn it into a TV series? So we spent a certain amount of time outlining, and the way that worked is I would do a draft and I would send the outline to him, and he would do a draft and he would send the outline back to me, and we were just rewriting and refining. He was expanding rightly in terms of plot and character. I was then contracting again in terms of making it kind of punchy, but we've had very complementary styles. And that was lovely. You start off with something rough and you end up with something fantastically finished, and you're just bashing it backwards and forwards. I was particularly thrilled with that because he is a very, very busy writer, and he found time to always deliver what he said he was going to deliver when he said he was going to deliver it, which is something I admire and appreciate more than I can say. But then, of course, once you get into production, that's a whole other thing. Jeremy and I went through some notes on the outline with a producer friend of his at a production company, who then took it out to broadcasters. And that was fascinating because she was approaching it from a very different viewpoint than we were, asking those kind of annoying but fundamental questions that producers ask. Why should I care? What's at stake? How can we sharpen up the story? How can we put this in its most punchy, dramatic form? All those kind of things that you do need those questions asked. But you have to have a certain fortitude to stick at it and make a career out of it, because the numbers are not on your side. Whether as a TV writer or a screenwriter, the number of screenplays you will write, as opposed to the number of screenplays that will get made, unless you're phenomenally lucky, unless you're, Richard Curtis or Andrew Davis. And even then, they will have undoubtedly projects that languish, projects that don't get made. But for most people, Bruce Robinson included, you have to be prepared to write a lot of screenplays in the knowledge that a lot of that writing won't get seen, which again was what drove me towards writing a novel, because ultimately a screenplay, however brilliant it is, even if it's been commissioned and you've been paid a lot of money to write it, if it doesn't go anywhere, it's only ever going to be read by a dozen, 2 dozen people at most. And it has no afterlife. If you've written it yourself on spec, you can pop it online. There are script websites for unproduced screenplays, but it's not going to be read in the same way. It is a blueprint for something that never happened. Whereas, and however brilliant that might be, and plenty of great examples of brilliant screenplays that have never got made by major screenwriters who are paid huge amounts of money. But a novel, it is what it is, or indeed a non-fiction book, anything that you can, do yourself. And now the medium is totally democratic. You can just stick it up on Kindle, which is what I did ultimately. And it's itself, it's its finished thing. It is, and it only has to please you. And as you say, your close circle of writing friends, and any writer hopefully has those people, that small number of people that they trust. And it might be shifting group depending on the project. Needn't be the same group. In fact, it probably shouldn't be the same group of people for each project. The people that understand what you're doing with a thriller aren't necessarily the same people that are going to understand what you're doing with a historical script, for example. But ultimately, the thing then only has to please you and that small group of people, and then you can stick it up on Kindle and Bob's your uncle. And it really doesn't matter how many people read it after that. You've done it. You've done the thing, and it is unmediated and is there for everyone to enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really a really interesting way of looking at it. I also think that I've always found this odd. I was talking to Charles Egan, who did the Michael Cimino biography recently. And he's talking about, how Cimino has these boxes and boxes and boxes of written scripts, complete scripts. And Cimino was one of the biggest, it was a fantastically, people running after him for his screenplays after Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. And but the minute he dies, they're worth nothing, And the same thing with sort of Kubrick and his Napoleon, Sergio Leone and his Leningrad script. The minute the director's dead, with the exception of sort of Spielberg making AI, nobody's looking for Tarkovsky's unproduced film script that they're going to make into a movie, or David Lynch's unfinished. David Lynch is still alive, so I shouldn't mention him in the same breath. But you know what I mean? It seems weird. I'm talking to an American director at the moment, and I was sort of suggesting that they publish their sort of scripts that they've got going back to the 60s, going back to the 70s. But at the same time, I recognize that actually going to a publisher and saying, I've got 5 scripts by this guy, no matter how name recognized they are, they're just like, nobody reads scripts. Why would anybody read a script?
There was a brief, again, publishing is interesting. There was a brief flowering pretty much around the same time or shortly after the Directors on Directors series, where Faber in particular, but not just Faber, were publishing a lot of screenplays. I think that was principally down to Quentin Tarantino, actually.
And maybe the Coen brothers as well. I remember the Coen brothers.
And the Coen brothers, yes, absolutely. Faber published both of theirs. To pick up on a point you made earlier, actually, about writing a script, which is very individual. There is a kind of subgenre of this, which is if you're already an established writer and you know that you have a reasonable writer-director and you have a reasonable expectation that what you're writing is going to get made, you actually don't necessarily have to write the script in the same way as if you're a writer for hire or a spec writer. The script I'm thinking of in this regard, which is one of my favorite screenplays to simply read, is the Coen brothers' Hudsucker Proxy. which barely even bothers with normal scene straps, interior, exterior. It has a flow, just like the movie has a flow. It's almost as if the camera is tracking you through this script. And I'm not sure that if any other writers attempted that, I think people would be trying to say, no, you need to have your cut twos and your interiors and your blah, 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 blah. But it's a brilliant screenplay, The Hudsucker Proxy. It's just such a pleasure to read.
I think Tarantino is the same thing. Is like, his 5-page speeches. Any other screenwriter would be told, "What the fuck are you doing? You can't do that. Get rid of that." That's like,
he went out and did it with Reservoir Dogs, and he showed that it could be done. And obviously, everything for him flows from there. And they are very readable scripts, and I think they help make screenplays for a brief period of time, maybe a few years. Methuen were in on the act, publishing scripts by Anthony Minghella. They were often tied to big Oscar releases. Either they were very trendy like Tarantino, or it was sort of adaptations maybe, or the Newmarket script series in America, where the shooting script series, they're great. Shawshank, Truman Show, Erin Brockovich, Little Miss Sunshine is the most recent one I've bought of that, which is a lovely introduction by the screenwriter Michael Arndt, who was pretty much on his uppers when he wrote that script. He had run out of money. He was living in a walk-up apartment in Brooklyn or somewhere. And he said, right, this is it. After this, I'm giving up screenwriting completely. He had like whatever, $50 in his bank account. And it's a film about feeling like you're on the brink of failing at all your life dreams and are a complete loser. He wrote the script that is about how he was feeling. It was him. It was what was in his heart. And of course, it's the one that ultimately sold and got made brilliantly. It's rather an inspiring story. It's a great script, lovely introduction, brilliant movie. You can kind of track it through and like, wow. Occasionally it is just worth keeping on going.
Yeah. That reminds me of Lee Van Cleef meeting. Sergio Leone went to cast the for a few dollars more, and he wanted Lee Van Cleef because he remembered him being in My Darling Clementine, the man who shot Liberty Valance, and he turned up. Tracked him down in Hollywood, and he's basically staying at a hotel, I think. And Leone and his producer was sitting in a foyer, and Van Cleef came in, and he was like, he had overalls on and was covered in paint because he was not working as an actor anymore. He started painting houses and stuff as to make money, and they basically had a bag of money in there because they thought, we're going to go and meet this actor, we've got to impress him that we want him for the role. And they basically opened this bag of money up and said, would you come and shoot our film in Italy? And he was like, yeah. Which is just like, yeah, never give up. You never know what's around the corner. You
never give up, never surrender, to quote Galaxy Quest.
Yeah. On that bombshell. I want to ask you, what's your recommended book for our readers? It can be for our listeners. Sorry, God, we're talking about books and writing, so I'm reading in the brain now. What would you recommend?
Film books.
Yes.
I think two immediately come to mind, and ironically enough, neither of them are by writers. One is Sidney Lumet's Making Movies.
Brilliant book, yeah.
I think Sidney Lumet is one of the greatest and possibly most underrated filmmakers of his era. And that was quite a long era. He started in the 50s, he's working through the 60s, 70s, 80s. He made classics in every decade. Maybe not the 90s, but
his last film was amazing.
Sorry,
his last movie was Before the Devil Knows You're Dead.
Yes, yeah. It's that feels like it feels like a 1970s film, doesn't it? It's raw and it's edgy, but you wouldn't necessarily think that a director of his age, however old he was at that point, would have made it. So he wrote this book called Making Movies, which came out in, wouldn't even like to guess, early 90s maybe. and it's brilliant. It's full of insight. He's not gossipy because he respects the people he's worked with, but at the same time, it's full of fantastic anecdotes. There's one I always remember. It's about Network, and he was meeting with Faye Dunaway about the part that she ultimately played. And according to him, the meeting starts and she's coming towards him, and the first thing he says is, "I know what you're going to ask. Where's the vulnerability in this character? There is none. And if you try to put any in, I'll cut it in the editing room." Now, I don't know whether that's true or not. And of course, he says, "Well, she was in after that. She was, and I think there is vulnerability in the character, but a bit like, it's not a how to direct a film book per se, like you would Creative Essentials or similar, the people that did the Art of Screen adaptation. You can get plenty of how to direct a film books. And yet, if you fillet it, if you read it, it will tell you everything you need to know about making a film, from the practicalities of, trucks on set through to, he describes certain shots, how they got that fantastic shot with the train leaving the station in Murder on the Orient Express. They had one take to get that. They had the train in an engine outside Paris, I think, a train in a shed outside Paris, and the light was coming up, and it was a very complicated maneuver. The train's coming towards the camera cranes up, it has to focus in on the Wagon Lee sign, which has to be in focus, and then you pan as the train goes past, and he's singing the praises of the camera operator who nailed it first take. And it's full of interesting anecdotes. If you read it in conjunction with William Goldman's Adventures in the Screen Trade, which I'm sure people have recommended before. And again, I do tend to find Goldman a little didactic, but he is very gossipy. He is very entertaining in his own very self-confident way. But there's an anecdote in both. If you can sort of take the two books and you can put an anecdote together and form a picture of something, which was the development of the script of The Verdict. The Verdict was based on a book by the Boston lawyer Barry Reed, and was adapted into a script initially for Robert Redford. Now, the book is about an alcoholic lawyer who's faced with a medical malpractice case. It's a redemptive story. It's his last chance. But according to Goldman, and I think the story is sort of told from a different angle by Lumet in Making Movies, the alcoholic angle was problematic. And they went through trying to come up with a script that Redford would sign off on. They went through several writers who kind of started filling in the backstory and filling in the blanks, and the subtext became text, and the alcoholism was sort of neutered. And then after a while, it just sort of died, as these things often do. If you've gone through development hell and rewrite after rewrite after rewrite, directors left, writers left, Redford left. The original screenplay had been by David Mamet. So it was pretty uncompromising, and I imagine fairly faithful adaptation of the book. And then Lumet was approached many years down the line. Ironically, one of the writers who had a crack at it in the meantime was his partner, J. Preston Allen. And he said, "Yeah, I'll do this, but we're going to go back to the Mamet draft. All the Mamet draft needs is an ending, because it's called The Verdict, but it ends before the verdict." And what really amused me about this story, and so once Lumet is attached to the Mamet draft, which is the draft Redford had first, apparently Redford made it known that he was available. By now, of course, it's possibly Paul Newman's finest performance. I think it's Lumet's finest film. And when you're with a director who's made 12 Angry Men, Fail Safe, Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, to say one of them is the best is really saying something. I think The Verdict is just a masterpiece. And the other thing you learn from making movies is, I was saying earlier about how Tom McCarthy's Spotlight feels Lumet-ish in the way that he sort of gets out of the way of the story. If the best thing to do is put the camera in the corner of the room, Bruce talks about this in Smoking in Bed as well, then that's what he will do. But that underplays the extent to which Lumet was actually quite a shrewd stylist. if you look at 12 Angry Men, for example, there is a camera plan at work in that film and a lighting plan, because it's hot, it's raining, it's getting dark. The camera angle changes. I can't remember which way it goes. It starts shooting down and ultimately ends up shooting up, and it starts moving in closer. The lenses change. So you might think, well, it's basically just a black and white film of a stage play. It is so not. It is a very carefully choreographed and shot and lit piece of cinema. And the same is true of The Verdict. I remember him talking about the use of the color palette in the film, and there's no reds, there's no yellows, it's very much kind of brown, blue, gray, a kind of, maybe vague orange, but it's an autumnal color palette to suggest a sort of decay and, someone at the end of his rope. So I was really impressed with making movies. It makes you look at, it does what the best movie writing does, which is it makes you look at the movies again with fresh eyes. Think, I've seen this 10 times and I never saw that. And my other book, which I mentioned just now, is Final Cut: Dreams and Disaster in the Making of Heaven's Gate. Now, actually, I listened to this morning to your Q&A with Charles Elton about his Cimino biography, which I'm now definitely going to buy and read, because clearly the view of Heaven's Gate in Final Cut is very much Steve Bark's view. Steve Bark was the head of production at United Artists at the time. He was one of the executives who greenlit the picture. He doesn't spare himself. I mean, one of my favorite lines in the book, I can't quite quote it verbatim, but there's a chapter, I think, which ends with something like, and as one of my first decisions, I'd greenlit a film that would sink the company. Something. It's like he was fully taking responsibility. But obviously, having listened to the thing this morning, the notion that Heaven's Gate in and of itself on its own sank United Artists is disputed, or indeed that United Artists sank. But Final Cut reads like a thriller. It is, it's gossipy, and it's not just about Heaven's Gate. The story of Heaven's Gate, as told by Steve Bark, is fascinating. It's as exciting as a thriller. Every time Cimino makes a demand about something and they give in, you're like, don't give in, it's only going to get worse. And it does. But it's actually a picture of United Artists at that point in its development. A company that was set up by the artists, the lunatics taking over the asylum, I think was the comment at the time, and had been bought by Transamerica, and was very focused on trying to re-establish itself in the Hollywood community at that moment in the late 70s. It had the Pink Panther films on its slate, it had the Bond films on its slate, but on the other hand, it had a lot of stuff that wasn't working. And it's really interesting to see this new team, including Bark, brought in and basically being given a certain carte blanche to go out there and find projects. So there's a lot of stuff in the book about other projects that they're looking into. They're talking to Truman Capote about a book that he's had, or a screenplay, and they're sort of assembling this slate. And there's all kinds of interesting vignettes in there. Bark goes out to talk to Peter Sellers about another Panther film in Switzerland, and he's not very well at the time, and his wife is there, and it's sort of a very moving sort of insight into all of the moving parts that are going on at this studio at the time, of which Heaven's Gate is one of the biggest moving parts and becomes this kind of sinkhole into which all this time and energy is going. As I say, it sounds from the Charles Elton book like there is very much a counter view to that. And I'm really keen to read that now to see what that is. But as a piece of film writing, as an explication of how crazy the film world can get, from the point where you've got a little script that actually no one wanted to make. It was sort of kicking around, this script called Pay Dirt, which was a kind of down and dirty Western about this little piece of American history that everyone had forgotten about. And it becomes this $40 million, close to 4-hour epic. It's such a good story, in fact, that it's a big influence on, I think, on Ray Connolly, the British novelist and screenwriter, when he wrote his novel Shadows on a Wall, which came out in the early 90s, which takes that, transplants it to the early 90s, makes it a film about Napoleon. But it's basically, it's such an entertaining read. It's as if John Grisham has decided to take on Heaven's Gate. Great.
Brilliant. Well, those are two great recommendations. Final Cut, I'm not sure it's been recommended before. I mean, it's a book, it's a gap in my knowledge. I've definitely, I've had the opposite thing of reading the Charles Elton book and thinking, I really ought to read Final Cut now to see what I think that, along with Devil's Candy, are two books which are really feel like they're the inside, specifically of flops, specifically of films that don't do particularly well at the box office and then get reassessed later. Although Bonfire of the Vanities, I mean, I rewatched it prior to talking to Julie about about her book, but yeah, it doesn't stand up. It's not like it's not going to be rediscovered anytime soon as a classic.
So it's not one that if I ever revisited it, it would be sort of raised eyebrow curiosity rather than anything else.
Yeah, it's very okay.
Charles did talk in your interview about how failures or flops are sometimes more interesting than successes, and I understand what he means by that. And these flops exactly, but difficult films, and you know, there's a couple of those in. There's a couple of those in the Bruce Robinson book. Jennifer 8 was a difficult film. It wasn't a big epic like Bonfire of the Vanities. Batman and Little Boy was a difficult film. Many of the films I loved growing up were difficult films. The Mission was a difficult film, I think, to make. Greystoke. I'm convinced there's a different, fantastic cut of that film lying around somewhere, because the finished version just doesn't rhythmically feel quite right, but it's full of absolutely incredible stuff. It has an ambition that British cinema so rarely has or is able to have these days.
Yeah, you do. You sort of, British cinema at the moment, I mean, in many ways, it's very exciting and diverse, and it's doing a lot of different things. And it's taken to heart something Putnam said. I remember him saying in the 80s, which was, you know, why can't British cinema produce the Ghostbusters movie? You know, why don't we have a Ghostbusters movie? And I think British cinema sort of replied to that by going, okay, here's a full Monty, here's a bunch of feel-good comedies. Yeah. Maybe at the cost of then not being so good at the prestige films that they were, hitherto have been more famous for. But I don't know. I mean, it's British cinema.
Well, we're great at literary adaptations, I think.
Yeah.
The demise of Merchant Ivory as a company obviously meant that regular tentpole. I mean, again, I'm an enormous fan of Merchant Ivory. I know that's not necessarily very trendy, or there was a period where it wasn't. The Remains of the Day is my favorite film. I think A Room with a View is tremendous. And also the sort of eclipsing of Miramax, obviously, because a lot of those films, biggish British films or films with big British talent, were being driven by those kind of mini majors. It's I find it quite hard to imagine a film like The English Patient or Talented Mr. Ripley getting made today. But smaller literary adaptations like Moira Buffini's The Dig, which came out on Netflix, premiered on Netflix, was terrific. And I saw the most fantastic adaptation the other day. I've not read the book, but I think it's going to be one of those films that people will discover and recommend to each other, but most people won't have heard of, a bit like Stephen Knight's Locke with Tom Hardy. It's John Michael McDonough's The Forgiven, based on the novel by Lawrence Osborne, which just came out with Ralph Fiennes and Jessica Chastain. Again, very inflected with 1970 cinema, particularly Antonioni's The Passenger. And it's one of the most staggering films I've seen in the cinema in decades. I was absolutely blown away by it. I was literally raving to the cinema staff as I left.
Wow.
The screen. Now, I don't know whether it's a good, bad, or indifferent adaptation. The novelist seems to very much like it, but because it's John Michael McDonough, it grabs you by the throat from the opening and it does not let go.
Right.
It's astonishing.
Right.
So, and I think it was focus features, but it felt like a British film. So, you know, these kind of cracking British movies are definitely still out there.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I think the death of. I remember I went to see James Ivory. He was producing a film based on the Aspen Papers in Venice, and I went to see him on the set and spent the day with him. Had a great conversation, absolutely brilliant time with him. Very, very funny. Very, very gossipy. About Paul Newman on Mr. and Mrs. Bridge, and all the stuff about Remains of the Day and everything. And at one point, we're watching Vanessa Redgrave do a scene, and this guy we're watching on a monitor, and this guy comes up to us and sort of nods and sort of says, "Hello, who are you?" And you start talking to him, and everybody else seems to be sort of like, Jesus, get that guy out of here. So not quite, but they're not paying much attention to him. And at one point I say, hi, how are you? What's your role on the film? What are you doing? And he was the writer. And I was like, oh no. oh no.
The spectre at the feast.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But listen, Alistair, what a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much for finally, after I should tell listeners that we've been planning to talk since, I think, January. I think
maybe even longer, actually. It was quite a long time. So I'm really happy that we finally managed to land this and have such a lovely, wide-ranging conversation.
Wow, absolutely. And I want to stand up for Merchant Ivory as well. You mentioned that earlier. And I think sometimes the Europeans are much better at appreciating these sort of unflashy directorial visions than we are in the Anglo-Saxon world. We sort of tend to see directing as something you should notice. And the Europeans like directors who you don't actually, their style is you don't notice their style,
I think Merchant Ivory, they were unfairly dubbed heritage cinema, and I don't even really know what that means.
Alan Parker called them the Laura Ashley of cinema, and that was like kind of nailed it in a bad way. If you,
I'm not going to comment on that. I will say that often these unobtrusive directors, and Lumet, as we talked about, is a good example. They are actually doing a lot. It's not in your face.
Yeah,
there's stuff in Remains of the Day, and it ain't my favorite film for nothing. Not just because I think it's an immensely moving book, terrific screenplay by Ruth Projavala, although there was big input from Harold Pinter there, I think too. There's a scene, just to give you one tiny example. There's a scene early on. I think it's during the credit sequence actually, where Mr. Stevens stops in front of a door, padded door, which has a window in it. And we're hearing a letter exchange between him and Miss Kenton before he goes on his journey to meet her. And she's walking down the corridor. He sees her walking down the corridor, and it's a memory. And as she's walking down the corridor, she literally dissolves out of shot. So she sort of, through the porthole window, she just dissolves into his, and then he pushes open the door and he's much older and he's walking down the corridor. Now, it's unobtrusive, but it's also beautiful, and it does so much. In concert with the voiceover and the music by Richard Robbins. I think they were he's a terrific cinema artist, James Ivory. There's all kinds of goodies on that disc. If you ever have the time to look at the deleted scenes on the Remains of the Day DVD or Blu-ray, including a scene right at the end that Anthony Hopkins, according to James Ivory, they cut it. It was in the Pinter script, was cut from the Ruth Projavala script, and Anthony Hopkins was so upset it was gone, he threatened not to do the movie unless it was reinstated. So they reinstated it. It's a scene, it's in the book, and it's a scene where he's on the pier at the end, and James Ivory says, I think the reason he wanted it is because he gets to cry in the scene, and actors love to cry. But what is really interesting about it is you watch it without the commentary, and then you watch it with James Ivory's commentary, and you're looking at it and you're thinking, this actually isn't that well directed a scene. And then James Ivory himself says, you know what, looking at this scene again now, I don't think I was doing my best work here. I don't think I wanted this scene to be in the picture. I think my attack on it's a bit soft. It's a perfectly good scene, but I already knew I was going to cut it even as I was shooting it. And do you know what? when we showed the film to Anthony without this scene, he never asked about it. He never said, where was it? He never wanted it reinstated. And I thought that was fascinating. But actually, that scene goes to the heart of why I won't go into this now, but it goes to the heart of why the film is different from the book. There is something about that scene that doesn't fit in the Merchant Ivory version of Remains of the Day, but it's absolutely crucial to the Kazuo Ishiguro novel. So, but yeah, I think the heritage thing was wrong. I think The Remains of the Day is a pretty critical film about servitude and class distinction and fascism and empire and all the stuff that's in the Ishiguro novel very subtly is there in the film subtly.
And all the stuff that's here today, all the stuff that is absolutely, we look on our established past and the monarchy and the establishment with this sort of nostalgia, this sort of living embodiment of nostalgia, and we ignore the fact that half of the royal family loved the Nazis.
Well, and also the story of a butler who invests himself the best years of his life in this man, and he puts his own life on hold, and he entirely trusts in the moral compass of the man he's serving, and ultimately he comes to realize, well, maybe I should have thought for myself a bit more. And blimey, you look around the world around you now, that's a pretty relevant message.
Absolutely. Wow. Okay, listen, Alistair, absolutely brilliant talking to you. Hopefully you'll come back and talk to me again when you have your next book out, or even if we just think of a good topic to talk about. I'm quite happy to. You don't have to be
delighted.
You don't have to be shilling. We can.
Well, I'm not really shilling right now. Actually, it's 2 years since The Art of Screen Adaptation. The William Boyd book isn't out till next November, so that's cool. It's rather nice, actually. It's nice to revisit. It's nice to revisit Bruce. It's nice to revisit story and character and Hampton on Hampton. It's like visiting old friends.
What's the name of your novel as well, so we can direct listeners towards it?
The Vetting Officer.
The Vetting Officer, and that's available on Kindle.
It is. It's interesting, that one. Do you mind if I 2 minutes more?
Go ahead.
I originally was going to write that as a screenplay, in fact, and I had it in mind as a script for quite a long time, and I just never did that. And then it just sort of suddenly demanded to be written as a novel. But it's the original story. It was very influenced by movies, British movies, particularly British political movies, specifically the Defence of the Realm, The Whistleblower, British TV political series Edge of Darkness, very British coup, that kind of period of Thatcherite paranoia. We had our period of Thatcherite paranoia about 10 years after the Americans had theirs with Nixon, and they get All the President's Men, the Parallax View. We get Defence of the Realm, Whistleblower, and that kind of went into this book. But I originally conceived of it as a sort of cross between a spy story and a ghost story. And funnily enough, as it developed, it became more like a cross between a spy story and a love story. I read Julian Barnes' Sense of an Ending, or reread it whilst writing the book. And then I saw the fantastic adaptation by Nick Payne, again, a very little seen film, it seems to me, and a wonderful film with Jim Broadbent, of adaptation of Sense of an Ending. And funnily enough, that film made me change direction slightly in terms of writing the novel, so it ultimately became more literary and less generic. So there's definitely a lot of Le Carré in there, a bit of 1980s British political film and TV drama, a bit of Julian Barnes, and just a soupçon possibly of Susan Hill, which is sort of where it started out.
Brilliant. Well, I look forward to reading that myself, and hopefully our listeners will have a go at it. Thank you again, Alistair, and talk to you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. Very nice to talk to you.
So that was my conversation with Alistair. I hope you enjoyed it. It was I think we certainly covered everything. We went all the way around. He's done a lot. He's talked to a lot of people, and as I said it during the conversation, it's kind of interesting to question a questioner, so to speak. But I really found it an enlightening conversation. I hope you did too. All that's left for me to do is thank Ali Harwood for the art, Elliot Atkins for the wonderful music, and thank you also, dear listener, for joining me. And I will be back next week with another episode. Until then, take care.
As the days get shorter and the nights chillier, it's tough to keep up your fall workout routine. Thankfully, there's Alo Moves, the app that brings workouts and wellness to the comfort of your home. Join alomoves.com with code ACAST for a 30-day free trial and 20% off an annual membership. From yoga and Pilates to sound baths and meditations, Alo Moves has it all, with classes made to fit every schedule. Find your perfect wellness routine anytime and anywhere with code ACAST at alomoves.com.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.